Imagine waking up in a small, cold stone house with the sun barely peeking through your window. Your bed? A pile of hay. Your job? Working the land for hours on end. You're a medieval peasant, and luxury is a word you've never heard. But hey, don't worry. At least you won't starve, right? Or maybe you will. So, grab your hay-filled pillow and prepare for a dive into the life of a medieval peasant, where survival was an art form and luxury meant having enough grain for the winter. Welcome to History Lullaby. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join us for more quirky, darkly, funny, and sometimes horrifying historical journeys. Now, slip into the worn sandals of a medieval peasant and see what life was really like. Don't worry, there will be hay, hard bread, and probably a little existential dread. Waking up before the sun even considers rising. The chill from the stone walls of your small, drafty home seeping into your bones. Your bed isn't soft. It's a pile of hay that pokes every part of your body in ways you didn't know were possible. Your blanket is a threadbare piece of wool, probably shared with the family's chicken, who snoozes happily while you silently pray it doesn't peck your nose awake. Welcome to the life of a medieval peasant. A life defined by exhaustion, constant labor, and a certain intimate familiarity with dirt. From the moment your eyes reluctantly open, your body is already on the clock. You'll drag yourself to the fields to tend crops, water plants, feed the animals, and patch fences that never stay fixed. And yes, it's raining again. Or maybe the sun is scorching, blistering your skin and making sweat pour into places you didn't think could sweat. Mud clings to your feet if you're lucky enough to have shoes at all, and sometimes your fingers crack from chopping wood or digging ditches. If you're lucky, there's food for breakfast, a slab of rye bread, hard as a brick, and some watered-down porridge. Don't get excited. Your spoon is wooden, and your porridge might have a few grains that haven't been cleaned properly. Chew carefully. Sometimes grit sneaks in, and a surprise shard of stone can make your morning interesting. Your stomach growls, not just from hunger, but from anticipation of another day where work is your only companion. By mid-morning, you've already planted, hoed, or harvested more than a modern adult would in a week. A horse decides it hates you and steps on your foot. Great. Pain becomes a constant, and somehow, the cold cuts deeper through soaked clothes than it did before dawn. And then there's the snow. Winter is relentless. Imagine trudging through knee-deep snow to feed your animals, while wind slices across your face like tiny invisible daggers. Fingers numb, toes frozen, and you're still expected to finish chores before noon. Any complaint is met with a glare from the Lord's steward, or worse, a reminder that laziness is a luxury only the upper class can afford. Sometimes, a peasant's day ends not with rest, but with extra labor because a fence needs mending, or the Lord has whims that must be obeyed. Hunger gnaws in the pit of the stomach. Fatigue clings to every muscle. And still, sleep offers only temporary relief before dawn brings another round of toil. Humans today complain about being overworked when they spend 8 hours at a desk. Peasants? They worked sunrise to sunset, often longer, with no pause button and no cafeteria. And if a misfortune, a storm, a pest, or a bad harvest strikes, weeks or months of extra toil follow. Every peasant knew hunger personally, intimately, like an uninvited relative who refuses to leave. Medieval society wasn't just harsh because of the elements. It was harsh because of the social pyramid. Peasants were at the very bottom, with lords, knights, and clergy holding power over their bodies, their labor, and their survival. A peasant didn't choose work. Work chose them. And laziness or rebellion? Swiftly punished. The Lord's manor loomed over your village, a constant reminder of your obligations. Taxes, tithes, and forced labor were the norm. Peasants paid rent in labor, in crops, and sometimes in personal servitude. The Lord's whims dictated daily life. Repair the bridge, dig the ditch, herd the animals, bake the bread for a feast you'll never attend. If your work was insufficient, there were consequences. Extra labor, public humiliation, or corporal punishment. Character building, they called it. Modern HR departments would faint. The church reinforced obedience. Sin, disobedience, and laziness were morally linked. So peasants weren't just oppressed physically, they were oppressed morally. Failure wasn't just personal. It was spiritually dangerous. Families relied on every member, including children, to contribute. No one escaped labor, no matter age or strength. Childhood was brief, often non-existent. Young ones learned to hoe, harvest, and care for animals, while their parents continued their endless toil. There were no school bells, no recess, no summer break. Just work, food if available, and more work. Peasants weren't entirely powerless. Communities banded together in minor acts of resistance, sharing food secretly, pooling labor to ease an individual's burden, or whispering jokes and stories to keep morale alive. But such acts were small. The system demanded obedience, and survival meant compliance. Ever wonder why peasants didn't live long? Probably because their idea of a break was fainting from exhaustion. If they got a chance to sit for more than 5 minutes, that was considered a luxury. And this wasn't just hyperbole. Sitting, leaning, or lying down could be seen as sloth if done in the presence of a lord or overseer. Peasants learned to eat, work, and sleep in shifts dictated by necessity rather than comfort. If you slept too long or too well, you risked both hunger and punishment. Even leisure was limited. Music, storytelling, and occasional gatherings provided mental respite. But the shadow of labor loomed constantly. Festivals brought brief joy, but these were rare. Most time was spent surviving, tilling the fields, tending to animals, and repairing the very tools that enabled you to survive another day. Peasants faced a world of constant environmental hazards. Floods destroyed crops, winter froze food stores, and summer droughts decimated fields. Tools were crude and dangerous. An unsharpened scythe could slice your leg open, a cart could collapse on your foot, and livestock could stampede, leaving you bruised or worse. Illness was another daily threat. No antibiotics, no modern hygiene, no vaccination. Fevers, infections, and wounds could quickly become fatal. A simple cut from a hoe could fester, sometimes killing before a physician could be summoned. Herbal remedies existed, but were limited in effectiveness, and superstition often guided their use. The combination of relentless work, environmental hazards, and social pressure meant that peasants needed resilience, ingenuity, and a strong constitution to survive. They had no safety nets. Survival required keen observation, clever resource management, and sometimes sheer luck. Despite these hardships, peasants were the foundation of medieval life. Without their labor, fields would lie fallow, towns would starve, and lords and monarchs would go hungry. The prosperity of the elite rested on peasant toil. Their work enabled trade, built infrastructure, and maintained the social order. Yet peasants themselves reaped few rewards. Health, comfort, and even safety were rare. Their existence was a constant balancing act between survival, service, and occasional small joys. And yet, communities thrived in miniature. Shared harvests, village gatherings, and local celebrations offered a sense of purpose and belonging amidst hardship. Imagine waking up to the smell of a morning that promises nothing more than a slab of hard, dry bread and a bowl of gruel that looks more like mud than food. This is the reality of the medieval peasant's kitchen. A tiny, drafty room with a hearth that struggles to keep warm and a cat that's claimed your best blanket. Breakfast is not a comforting ritual. It's a matter of survival. Diet, fuel, not flavor. Peasants didn't have the luxury of gastronomic delight. Meals were functional, designed to fuel back-breaking work rather than tickle the taste buds. The diet was simple, repetitive, and minimal. Bread. The cornerstone of every peasant's diet was bread, usually made from coarse rye or barley flour. Forget fluffy loaves with crusty golden tops. This bread was dense, often stale, and sometimes contained surprises like small stones from poorly sieved grain. Each bite could be a gamble. Chew carefully. Otherwise, you risk a chipped tooth or a swollen gum. Gruel. Gruel was the daily companion, a watery porridge made from oats, barley, or other grains. Sometimes it was laced with milk or water, and rarely sweetened with a dash of honey, if honey was available at all. Its consistency could vary from thin soup to thick paste. But its flavor? Let's just say peasants didn't eat gruel for taste. They ate it to survive. Vegetables. Cabbage, onions, leeks, and root vegetables like turnips or carrots were standard. Freshness depended entirely on the season. Some days a peasant might gnaw on a raw carrot, only to discover it was already half frozen from the previous night's frost. Legumes. Beans, peas, and lentils were also common, providing protein and calories. But again, no spices or sauces to make them exciting. Just boiled, mushy, and bland, ideal for keeping hunger at bay while you work the fields. Meat and fish. Meat was rare. Even a chicken or a fish was usually reserved for a feast day or a special occasion. Occasionally, a peasant might receive scraps from the Lord's table, but that was a privilege, not a guarantee. Hunting small game or fishing was allowed, but most peasants had little time, skill, or tools to catch anything substantial. Spices were luxury items, traded from distant lands, and reserved for the rich. Imagine eating the same flavorless diet day in and day out, without the comforting aroma of herbs or even a hint of seasoning. Survival, not enjoyment, dictated the menu. A peasant's diet wasn't just bland, it was seasonal, and often cruelly so. Summer might bring a small bounty, milk from goats or cows, fresh vegetables, and the occasional egg. Winter was a different story. The cold months brought darkness, frozen soil, and empty storage bins. Stored grains and root vegetables were all that stood between a peasant and true famine. Bad harvests were catastrophic. A single failed crop could result in weeks of hunger, malnutrition, or even death. Villagers relied on each other for survival, sharing whatever little they had. Still, scarcity shaped life. Each bite was calculated. Each meal, a delicate balance of filling the stomach without completely exhausting the small supply of food available. Peasants also practiced inventive ways to stretch their rations. Soups and stews were common, boiling vegetables with grains and whatever scraps of meat or fish were available. Herbs might be added if luck smiled, but more often the flavor was bitter or earthy, reminding you with every swallow that this was survival food, not a delicacy. Cooking itself was a challenge. Most peasants had tiny hearths, open fires, or simple clay ovens. Fuel was scarce, often wood collected from nearby forests or fields, sometimes damp and smoky. Cooking a pot of gruel or a loaf of bread was a time-consuming effort, requiring constant attention to prevent burning or undercooking. Meals were simple and communal. Families gathered around a single bowl or loaf, passing portions as needed. Utensils were rare, so everyone likely ate with hands. Hygiene was minimal. Washing before eating was a luxury, not a habit. Flies, dust, and the occasional chicken pecking at scraps added unplanned seasoning to the day's meal. The peasant diet, while sufficient to sustain basic labor, was far from healthy. Limited protein and micronutrients led to conditions such as rickets, vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight or dietary sources, especially in winter. Scurvy. When fruits and vegetables were scarce, vitamin C deficiency could appear, causing swollen gums, weakness, and fatigue. Malnutrition. Chronic hunger and poor diet stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and made peasants susceptible to illness. Yet peasants ate what they had. There were no alternatives, no supermarkets, no emergency meal kits. Hunger was constant, and each meal was a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Food was more than fuel. It was anxiety and hope intertwined. Villagers thought strategically about meals, which grains to save for the next week, which vegetables to cook first, and how to ration meat if it appeared. Every bite had meaning. Fasting wasn't always voluntary. Sometimes it was forced by scarcity. Children, the elderly, and the sick often received the smallest portions. Watching others eat more while your belly protested was a lesson in patience, endurance, and understanding your social place. To put it simply, their daily diet was a test of survival. If you weren't hungry after gruel and stale bread, well, congratulations, you're likely not alive. Or you've learned to ignore the pain. Indeed, medieval peasants developed a kind of culinary resilience. They endured hard bread that could double as a doorstop, gruel so thin it could almost be drunk through a straw, and vegetables that tasted like they were grown in pure irony. And yet, somehow, they persisted. Hunger was an ever-present companion, but it was tolerated with grim humor, clever tricks, and occasional illicit treats stolen from gardens or markets. Despite the monotony, there were occasional luxuries. Feast days, religious festivals, and harvest celebrations brought rare sweets or meat. Honey, though expensive, was treasured. Occasionally, a family might taste a piece of cheese, a herring, or a small bird roasted for special occasions. These were moments of joy and reprieve. A child might secretly nibble a bit of honey, savoring the sticky sweetness on their tongue, knowing it wouldn't last. Bread might be baked with a tiny bit of spice or shaped into an animal for amusement. These small delights reminded peasants of life beyond survival, the possibility of pleasure, however fleeting. Stepping out of your small, cold stone hovel into the village morning, the air is damp, the streets muddy, and the smell of smoke, animals, and something vaguely rotting follows you like a shadow. You're a medieval, peasant-strong, resilient, and probably a little desperate. And yet, no matter how careful you are, death has a habit of hanging around. In the Middle Ages, the single most terrifying aspect of daily life wasn't just hunger, hard labor, or the Lord's temper. It was disease. The Black Death, along with smallpox, typhus, and other epidemics, was not a distant threat. It was the ominous, invisible visitor that could wipe out entire villages overnight. One moment, your neighbors are alive, arguing over who gets the last loaf of bread. The next, they're gone, leaving behind silence, despair, and fleas. Doctors? Forget it. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, not even much understanding of germs. Healing often relied on superstition, herbal remedies, and prayer. You might be offered a poultice made of leeches, crushed herbs, or mud to draw out the sickness, while someone else might suggest hanging garlic around your neck to ward off evil spirits carrying the plague. And don't even think about questioning it. You're a peasant. Questioning a supposed remedy could get you scolded, cursed, or ignored entirely. Life expectancy was low. Infants were particularly vulnerable. Families prayed that their children would survive their first few years. Sometimes, entire households were decimated in a single epidemic, and when you survived one outbreak, there was always another lurking around the corner. But it wasn't just the plague. Life as a peasant was a constant dance with disease. Water. Wells were often contaminated. Streams were open sewers. Drinking water was more likely to make you sick than quench your thirst. Rats. Furry little merchants of death, running freely through barns, homes, and streets. Fleas carried disease, and the rats didn't even leave a receipt for their services. Lice and fleas. Sharing a bed with siblings or family members? Expect parasites. Scratching itches was not a leisure activity. It was survival. Sanitation. There weren't exactly bathrooms as we know them. Waste disposal was crude. Streets were mud, choked, and human and animal waste often mingled freely. You either learned to step carefully or risk infection. Even minor injuries were terrifying. A cut from a broken tool could become infected, sometimes fatally. A sprained ankle, a punctured finger, or even a scraped knee had the potential to spiral into fever, gangrene, and, well, eternal rest. The medieval world was one giant hazard zone, and peasants had no option to opt out. When illness struck, remedies were eclectic. Some were surprisingly logical given the knowledge of the time, like using certain herbs with antimicrobial properties. Others were, frankly, weird. Poultices, crushed plants, animal fat, or mud applied to wounds or buboes. Sometimes helpful, sometimes just smelly. Fumigation, burning herbs and incense in the home to cleanse the air. The smoke might have scared away some insects, but it certainly didn't stop fleas or plague. Bloodletting, leeching or cutting veins to balance humors, mostly led to weakness and fainting rather than recovery. Prayer and relics. For the deeply pious, touching relics or making pilgrimages was believed to protect against illness. If nothing else, it gave people something to do while disease loomed. Survival was often a mix of luck, basic hygiene, and knowing which superstitions to follow. You might survive by chance, But just as easily, you could fall ill and never recover. Peasant cottages were small, crowded, and poorly ventilated. Multiple generations might sleep in one room, sharing the same bedding. Cats, chickens, and pigs often wandered inside freely, adding extra pathogens to the mix. Venturing out into the fields didn't help. Muddy work, exposure to the elements, and contact with wild animals all increased the risk of infection. Children, elderly, and the weak were most at risk. Parents could do little to protect their families. Herbs, charms, and prayers were comforting rituals rather than effective defenses. And even when a peasant managed to stay healthy, the constant awareness of disease added a psychological weight that modern humans might find unbearable. Every cough, scratch, or fevered glance was a potential death sentence. Despite the ever-present threat of disease, communities adapted in their own ways. Isolation. Sick family members might be confined to a corner of the cottage or a separate hut, more for social control than effective quarantine. Herbal potions. While efficacy was limited, mixing herbs like sage, thyme, and garlic was common. At least it smelled strong enough to feel protective. Religious rituals. Blessings, processions, and prayer gatherings reinforced communal bonds, providing emotional relief, if not physical safety. Superstitions. Carrying charms, avoiding certain days, or avoiding specific people believed to be cursed. Modern epidemiologists might call it useless, but for peasants, belief was everything. Even humor was a tool for survival. Jokes, rhymes, and exaggerated stories about disease helped people cope with the inevitability of death around them. Dark humor was common. It was a small way to maintain control over a world where control was otherwise impossible. If you weren't starving or overworked, you'd probably get plague. And if you survived that, congratulations, you were still just one leech, infected rat, or bad wound away from death. And remember, washing hands wasn't a thing, just a medieval suggestion. So, every meal was a gamble, every field walked a risk, and every sneeze a potential death sentence. The irony? Peasants were incredibly resilient. Despite constant exposure to disease, poor nutrition, and harsh labor, communities persisted. Some villages survived decades, adapting to the perils of medieval life through ingenuity, communal support, and sheer stubbornness. Disease and plague were inseparable from medieval peasant life. Survival wasn't guaranteed, and even the healthiest peasant lived with a daily awareness of death. Yet, through superstition, rudimentary medicine, and sheer stubbornness, they managed to persevere. Life was dangerous, grim, and unpredictable, but it was lived fully, however precariously. Humor softened the edge of despair. Dark jokes about plague, infection, and foul food circulated in villages, allowing people to laugh in the face of terror. It was a psychological balm in a world without doctors or vaccines, a reminder that even in despair, humanity finds a way to cope. The morning sun barely makes its way through the narrow slit of your window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor of your small stone house. Your hands are stiff from hours of tilling soil. Your back aches from hauling buckets of water. And yet, there's only one thing pulling you from the monotony of exhaustion: the church bell. It's a summons, a reminder, a lifeline. You stumble out the door, brushing hay and dust from your clothes, and trudge along the dirt path that leads to the village chapel. The smell of damp earth, smoke from chimneys, and the occasional whiff of animal manure clings to the morning air. But inside the church, it's a different world. A place where labor, hunger, and fear fade, if only for a while. Inside, the dim light of candles flickers against the worn stone walls, creating moving shadows that seem almost alive. The scent of incense wafts through the air, slightly sweet, slightly bitter, and oddly comforting, cutting through the pungent reminders of life outside. You join the line of peasants, children clinging to the skirts of their mothers, elders leaning on crooked staffs, and a few well-dressed townsfolk trying not to look out of place among the mud-streaked boots and calloused hands. Everyone here is seeking something: hope, absolution, a few minutes of peace from the relentless grind of survival. The priest begins his sermon, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, a mixture of authority, ritual, and performance. He speaks of sins, of virtue, of the path to salvation. And while the words are meant to guide, they also serve as a mirror to the hardships of your own life. Every sin recounted feels painfully relatable. Every moral lesson a reminder of the work, obedience, and suffering that define your existence. And yet, strangely, there is comfort in this shared experience. You're not alone in hardship. The village, the congregation, the very structure of faith binds you together with others who know the same daily struggles. During the service, your mind drifts. You notice the small children quietly peeking around the pews, trying not to wiggle or cry, aware that their parents' wrath is almost as imminent as divine judgment. The elders hum along, eyes closed, lost in memories of easier days, or perhaps hallucinations from hunger. Some of the middle-aged villagers try to maintain solemnity, but an uncontrollable yawn escapes, drawing a brief glance from the person beside them. Even the priest's solemnity cannot mask the human need to breathe, stretch, and momentarily escape the weight of existence. In this, the church becomes a theater, a stage where each parishioner plays their role with varying degrees of skill, fear, and fatigue. And then come the festivals. Days when the monotony of labor is broken by color, sound, and even a hint of indulgence. Candlemas, Michaelmas, harvest festivals. Each provides a rare opportunity to eat something more than stale bread and watery soup, to sing a song, to dance in the open, and to remind yourself that life can, for fleeting moments, contain joy. During these occasions, the church grounds are transformed. Laughter mingles with the solemn hymns. Music from makeshift instruments fills the air, and small markets appear, offering treats that otherwise would be impossible for a peasant to taste. A simple honey cake can feel like divine nectar, the rare sight of roasted meat, a luxurious miracle. The role of religion in this context is not just spiritual, it is practical. It structures the week, the seasons, the day-to-day expectations. Mass in the morning, work in the fields by midday, evening prayers before the last of the sun dips behind the hills. The rhythm is relentless, yet it provides a scaffolding that supports the human spirit. In a world where famine, disease, and violence are constant companions, the predictability of ritual offers a sliver of control. You follow the pattern because it is known, because deviation might invite chaos, and because the tiniest sense of order is better than none. Yet, despite the gravity, there is humor tucked between the candles and sermons. Children fidget, elders mumble incomprehensible prayers, and even the sternest villagers occasionally exchange mischievous glances. You catch a glimpse of the priest struggling with a particularly stubborn candle, smoke curling around his face in a way that almost looks like he's questioning his own sermon. For a brief second, you smile, recognizing the absurdity of human persistence in the face of relentless hardship. The rituals themselves are strange, almost theatrical. Touching holy statues, lighting candles for the dead, muttering short prayers to saints whose names are as old as the village itself. These actions, at once simple and profound, create a buffer against the overwhelming reality of life as a medieval peasant. You don't just pray for food. You pray for protection from the plague, for your cattle to survive the winter, for a neighbor not to trample your small plot of land in their haste. These prayers are part hope, part bargaining, and part survival strategy, a psychological armor against what might otherwise be unbearable despair. Even the briefest exposure to sunlight while walking to and from the church can feel indulgent. You notice the frost glinting on the fields, the pigeons fluttering in the steeple, the distant children playing despite the cold, and for a moment, the oppressive weight of hunger and labor lifts slightly. It is fleeting, yes, but sufficient to remind you that life can be endured and occasionally even enjoyed despite the relentless hardships. And of course, superstition permeates everything. Certain saints are called upon for specific ailments. Certain gestures or objects are believed to ward off evil spirits. A child might clutch a small cross or a tiny charm, thinking it will protect against sickness or misfortune. While it may seem illogical to a modern mind, these acts are deeply ingrained, forming a network of belief that supports not just the individual, but the entire community. It is cohesion through shared faith. a collective embrace of the unknown that enables survival in an unforgiving world. By the end of the service, you are tired, physically and emotionally, but subtly fortified. The candle wax is hardened, the incense is burnt low, and the congregation begins to file out, each person returning to their own struggles. Yet, the moment in the church, a few minutes of structured communal breathing, of silent acknowledgement of hardship, and the occasional suppressed giggle has provided what little respite the body and mind can afford. It is a reminder that even in the bleakest of times, humans seek pattern, meaning, and, if they are lucky, a small sense of joy. The humor never fully vanishes. You see a man trying to hide a yawn behind his hand, a child tugging at a mother's sleeve, a cat darting across the stone floor, disrupting the incense smoke. Life goes on in all its messy, imperfect glory. And in that, there is something profound. The rituals, the songs, the communal presence, and even the silent judgments of fellow villagers all reinforce the continuity of human resilience. The church, with all its mystery, solemnity, and occasional absurdity, becomes not just a place of worship, but a sanctuary for the weary soul, a stage for communal storytelling, and a pause button on the relentless cycle of medieval peasant life. For just an hour, perhaps two, you are not just a peasant scraping survival from the soil. You are a participant in a human experiment stretching across generations, a tiny piece of a living history, bound by shared ritual, shared belief, and shared endurance. And in that shared experience, laughter and small moments of relief sneak through like the first light of dawn over a frostbitten field. Even after leaving the church and stepping back into the mud and manure, the heart remains slightly lighter, the steps slightly easier, and for a brief time, the world is less threatening. You are reminded, gently and absurdly, that in the life of a medieval peasant, faith is as much about survival as it is about belief, and that sometimes, in the flicker of candlelight and the echo of chants, the hardest lives are made a little more bearable. And yes, as you walk home, you can't help but chuckle at the thought that the collective suffering, endurance, and occasional absurdity of it all has been happening for centuries. And somehow, humanity survives anyway. By the time the last echoes of church bells fade and the villagers return to their muddy homes, the peasant day does not pause. It only shifts its focus. Labor continues. Chores remain. And survival still hangs in every decision. Yet somewhere in the middle of endless toil, a peculiar, understated kind of genius takes root. The medieval peasant, despite the relentless pressure of weather, disease, taxation, and hunger, becomes a master of improvisation. Tools are scarce, materials are limited, and formal knowledge is a luxury reserved for monks, guildsmen, or the occasional wandering scholar. In this environment, creativity isn't optional. It's the difference between warmth and frostbite, between a half-full belly and starvation. A chair is not just a chair. In a peasant household, it is a rock lashed to a wooden frame with strips of old cloth. It wobbles, it creaks, it threatens collapse, but it holds your weight well enough to keep your backside from planting itself in the dirt. An oven is not an appliance. It is a half-baked mound of clay, hollowed to hold embers, where bread can cook slowly, saving fuel and giving the family something to gnaw on besides root vegetables. A plow isn't polished iron with decorative handles. It is a sharpened stick, tied to a beam, dragged through stubborn soil with a pair of oxen that look increasingly tired of life itself. Every creation is rough, ugly, and utterly functional. The peasant eye sees what is needed, and the peasant hand finds a way to make it happen, using scraps and ingenuity as raw materials. In the fields, irrigation channels are dug not with shiny spades but with bent forks, broken hose, and bare hands, moving water from the stream to the parched earth. Little dams hold it in place, mud-slicked and precarious, but effective. The cleverness of a peasant is often measured not by finesse, but by survival rate. If the wheat grows, if the cabbages don't die, if the chickens make it through winter, the invention is a success. And in this harsh environment, failure is not a lesson. It is a risk to life. When winter strikes, as it inevitably does, peasants become engineers of warmth. Thatched roofs leak, Doors barely close, and windows are gaps in stone walls, letting in the bite of frost and the howls of wind. Straw is scavenged from every field to fill cracks in floors or walls. Worn clothing is layered to make rudimentary insulation. Fires are tended constantly, with dried twigs, dung, and whatever scraps of wood are available. Every ember is precious, every coal guarded as though it contains the sun itself. The ability to keep the family warm, fed, and alive is a skill honed under pressure, a continuous exercise in problem solving. Food preservation is another field where peasant ingenuity shines. Salted meat, when available, is buried in clay or stored in the cool ground to prevent spoilage. Root vegetables are dug into pits lined with straw to survive the winter. Grains are stored in hollowed-out containers or woven baskets elevated from the damp floor. Rats, insects, and the occasional cat burglar bird are constant threats, and the peasant's life is a perpetual chess game of protection and preparation. Surviving one winter is a testament to observation, patience, and subtle engineering. For hunting and gathering, peasants use traps that are crude but effective. Small game like rabbits, hares, or birds are snared using string, sticks, and the natural behavior of the prey itself. Fishing is accomplished with handmade hooks of bone or sharpened wood, lines braided from hair or thread, and baskets used as traps in shallow streams. Every meal is a product not just of toil, but of acute understanding of nature, observation of animal behavior, and improvisational skill. Children are apprentices in survival. From an early age, they are taught to spot edible plants, to understand the behavior of livestock, and to handle simple tools safely enough not to lose a finger or a life. The lessons are embedded in daily work rather than formal instruction. A child might learn algebra from counting bushels or history from tending the Lord's cattle. But the real education is in observation, endurance, and adaptability. When frost cracks the water in the stream, the child knows where the fish hide. When a fox stalks the chickens, they know where to set the trap. Ingenuity is learned by doing, and mistakes are often painfully instructive. Peasants also become inventors of small comforts. When rain leaks through the roof, a bit of cloth, clay, or wood can channel it away from the bedding. When a child's shoes are shredded, straw or moss can be stuffed into worn leather to keep the feet from freezing. Even entertainment is an exercise in creativity. A ball fashioned from rags, a wooden toy carved from a fallen branch, or a song adapted from the wandering minstrels who passed through the village. Each act of ingenuity is a small victory, a way to assert control in a life that otherwise offers little. The peasant's ingenuity extends to social solutions, too. Villagers cooperate to repair bridges, reinforce fences, or share surplus grain during tough seasons. Knowledge is passed orally. When a neighbor discovers a better way to store turnips, the trick spreads by word of mouth. When a farmer learns to rotate crops to avoid depletion, everyone benefits. In a time without printed manuals or scientific treatises accessible to the commoner, communal intelligence becomes as critical as individual skill. One cannot overlook the ingenuity required for hygiene and disease prevention. While knowledge of germs was non-existent, peasants developed crude but effective strategies. Washing hands in river water before meals, boiling water for tea or ale, or burning herbs to fumigate living spaces. Lice, fleas, and other pests were omnipresent. Yet simple techniques, often learned through trial and error, minimize their impact. While far from modern standards, these measures reflect a subtle understanding of cause and effect, honed under necessity rather than theory. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of peasant ingenuity is its application to mobility and transport. Carts, wheelbarrows, and sleds are improvised with wooden wheels, rope, and metal salvaged from wherever possible. Livestock is harnessed in creative ways to maximize efficiency, and grain or firewood is transported over long distances with minimal tools. Every journey is an exercise in mechanical problem solving, endurance, and patience. Even the construction of shelters demonstrates practical innovation. Houses are not comfortable or elegant, but they are functional. Mud, stone, and straw are combined to create insulation and protection against the elements. Roofs are sloped to shed rain and snow. Windows, if they exist, are covered with oiled parchment or cloth to retain warmth. Furniture is minimal, but cleverly designed to serve multiple purposes. Benches double as storage, tables serve as work surfaces and dining areas. The household is a compact exercise in resource management and adaptation. Survival often extends beyond the practical to the cunning. Peasants develop strategies to protect themselves from the whims of their lord. Requests for extra work are negotiated subtly. Illnesses are timed strategically. And small deceptions are tolerated if they help a family survive. Every day requires a careful balance between obedience and self-preservation. And ingenuity is as much about understanding human behavior as mastering tools or crops. In times of conflict, peasant ingenuity becomes a literal life-saving skill. During raids, villagers dig trenches, hide valuables in clever caches, and organize watches to signal danger. Weapons are improvised from farm implements. Small fortifications arise around homes. Every crop stolen or animal saved is a testament to cleverness, foresight, and quick thinking. In this harsh environment, ingenuity is survival writ large. Even in food preparation, creativity is essential. Gruel can be thickened with roots or flavored with herbs. Bread can be stretched further. And surplus vegetables can be preserved with smoke or fermentation. Each culinary innovation is born of scarcity and necessity, demonstrating the adaptability of a people for whom hunger is constant and patience is a skill. And humor, too, sneaks in between the lines of ingenuity. A makeshift chair wobbles just enough to keep the sitter alert. A home-built oven produces bread with the occasional stone baked in for texture. Traps fail spectacularly, only to teach children lessons in physics, patience, and humility. The peasant's world is dangerous and exhausting, but it is punctuated by small triumphs of wit, creativity, and the occasional absurdity of survival. In short, the medieval peasant is not merely a victim of circumstance, but a master of improvisation. Every tool fashioned from scraps, every food preserved with cunning, every home adapted to weather and pests is evidence of a life lived on the edge of necessity but with remarkable intelligence and resourcefulness. Why buy a hammer, they might joke among themselves, when a rock tied to a stick works just as well? It's not elegance, it's survival, and in that, there is an enduring genius. Through ingenuity, peasants carve out agency in a world that offers them very little. They adapt, invent, and cooperate. They make do with less, and in doing so, they create solutions that, to the modern eye, seem simple, yet are marvels of necessity. Every day is an experiment in resilience. Every small success, a victory against hunger, cold, and the caprices of the land. And in these victories, fleeting as they may be, the human spirit shines. By nightfall, when work is done, tools repaired, and the embers in the hearth dwindling, the peasant can sit on that wobbly chair, bite into a meager meal, and feel, for a moment, triumph. Survival is an art, creativity a weapon, and endurance a badge of honor. In a world without luxury, ingenuity is wealth, and each small invention, each clever adaptation, becomes a testament to life's stubborn persistence. By the time night falls and the frost begins to settle across the village, the peasant household doesn't suddenly shrink into silence. Instead, the small stone and thatch dwelling hums with the subtle chaos of survival shared across generations. Families are large, not for decoration, but for necessity. Children are born not only as little bundles of joy, but as laborers in training, carrying forward the family's survival skills from the moment they can toddle across the dirt floor. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and sometimes even distant cousins cohabit in the same cramped space. The family unit is a living machine, each member an essential cog. When one falters, the entire household risks calamity. The morning begins with a barely there sunrise peeking over the horizon, and immediately everyone is at work. Toddlers scurry after chickens, sweeping up stray grains, while older children help milk cows or fetch water. Parents coax oxen into fields, repairing broken carts or mending fences along the way. Grandparents, if age and disease haven't taken them, offer guidance and supervision, ensuring that the younger ones don't inadvertently maim themselves while chasing rabbits or wielding a hand-forged spade. Every movement, every task is a negotiation with the elements, the animals, and the merciless demands of survival. In this environment, Family life is not about leisure. It's a continuous loop of labor, learning, and resilience. Yet within these constraints, bonds form strong, unspoken, and vital. Peasants rely on each other, and not just for the immediate benefits of labor. Neighbors share grain when the last harvest fails, trade tools and seeds, and offer shelter in times of illness or misfortune. A barn burned down? Your neighbor lends a beam. A spring dries up? Someone knows a hidden well. A child falls ill? Someone else's wife or mother might lend herbal remedies or comfort the infant for a few hours so the parent can tend to the rest of the household. Survival, after all, is a cooperative endeavor. In a world where every day brings uncertainty, interdependence isn't a choice. It's a lifeline. Community bonds extend beyond pragmatic cooperation into ritual and celebration. Festivals, often tied to harvest cycles or religious observances, break the monotony of grueling labor, offering fleeting moments of joy and social cohesion. Villagers gather to sing, dance, and share food. Sometimes, they indulge in small games or playful competitions, testing strength or skill with a laugh and a bruised elbow. Even the smallest contributions, a loaf of bread, a jar of honey, a basket of vegetables, become social currency, cementing relationships and creating networks of reciprocity that can mean the difference between starvation and sustenance. In a harsh world, social bonds are as critical as fences or plows. The structure of family and community also shapes discipline and learning. Children learn by observation, by assisting elders, and by trial and error under watchful eyes. Mistakes are corrected gently when possible, harshly when necessary, because in survival, a simple error can have fatal consequences. A child who forgets to secure the chicken coop might lose the evening meal. A teenager who misjudges a cart's load could be crushed under a wheel. Yet these lessons, brutal as they are, also embed practical knowledge, resilience, and the ability to improvise. Peasant families become workshops of applied education, where life itself is the curriculum, and every misstep teaches adaptability. Humor, too, sneaks in amidst hardship. While children might have to share a straw-stuffed mattress with siblings, and perhaps a goat or two, they learn early that laughter can be as vital as food. Someone inevitably trips over a sleeping chicken. Someone else spills soup over the floor, and the resulting chaos becomes a tiny reprieve from unrelenting labor. These small moments, fleeting as they may be, are the threads that hold the social fabric together. Your family might sleep on straw next to goats, a peasant might mutter with a grin, but hey, at least you're not alone in your misery. Shared suffering, it turns out, builds loyalty, affection, and a sense of humor sharper than any plow blade. Bartering and trade are critical for survival and foster deep interdependence beyond the household. Families exchange milk for flour, eggs for firewood, labor for tools. Knowledge about who has what, who is trustworthy, and who owes a favor is essential. The local mill, blacksmith, and tavern aren't just businesses, they're nodes in a living network of economic and social support. And when winter approaches and granaries are low, these networks can literally mean the difference between survival and starvation. Resourcefulness in family life and in the village extends beyond the individual. It is a shared skill, a collective ingenuity honed by necessity. The architecture of peasant life further illustrates this communal approach. Houses are compact, multi-purpose spaces. Cooking, sleeping, and storage often overlap in a single room. Hearths serve as the heart of both warmth and nutrition. Firelight illuminating children doing homework, or its 14th century equivalent, while parents mend tools or weave baskets. Privacy is minimal. Comfort is scarce. Yet the family functions as a cohesive unit. Each member understands their role. Fetch water, stoke the fire, herd animals, repair fences. Everyone contributes. Everyone learns, and everyone benefits. Celebrations, even modest ones, reinforce these bonds. Harvest festivals, seasonal religious observances, or communal barn raisings are times for storytelling, music, and shared feasts. Peasants may not have wine flowing freely, but even a small keg of ale or a few handfuls of roasted nuts are enough to bring joy. Children chase each other around the village green. Adults trade gossip. and elders dispense wisdom in cryptic, half-humorous warnings about laziness, misfortune, or divine retribution. Even under the strain of poverty, these shared experiences create a rich, textured social life. Peasant communities are also remarkably adaptive. If crops fail, they innovate. If weather turns harsh, they invent ways to shelter livestock, protect grain, or store water. Skills and knowledge are passed from neighbor to neighbor, from parent to child, creating a living repository of practical intelligence. In a world without printed manuals or formal education, survival knowledge is social knowledge, embedded in stories, routines, and the repetition of generations. Even leisure is tied to survival and social cohesion. Games and simple competitions, tug of war with a rope, races with sacks of grain, tests of strength with logs, build physical fitness and teach children early lessons about coordination and strategy. Singing, storytelling, and dancing reinforce shared identity and preserve cultural memory. Humor emerges naturally. A child trips over a dog. A goat escapes into a neighbor's garden. Someone accidentally topples a makeshift fence. Laughter is both relief and currency, binding the community together. In essence, peasant family life is a continuous exercise in cooperation, creativity, and resilience. Individual survival is inseparable from collective effort. Households operate as miniature ecosystems, and villages function as interconnected networks, each member understanding that their well-being depends on the skills, knowledge, and loyalty of others. Ingenuity, endurance, and humor are not optional. They are survival tools, passed along with stories, practical advice, and the occasional scolding. Life remains harsh, the days long, and comfort fleeting. But the peasant community teaches lessons modern civilization sometimes forgets: resourcefulness, the value of cooperation, and the enduring power of human ingenuity. And in those moments, when a child giggles at a chicken's antics or a neighbor shares a hard-earned loaf of bread, one sees the resilience of spirit that sustains these communities against adversity. By the time the village quiets, only the soft glow of the hearth illuminating tired faces, and the night settles over straw-stuffed floors and creaking beams, the peasant can rest briefly. Tomorrow will bring the same toil, the same risks, the same endless battle against hunger, weather, and disease. But within the struggles, ingenuity and cooperation form the invisible scaffolding that keeps everyone alive. These family and community bonds are not mere conveniences. They are essential lifelines, the social mortar holding together a life otherwise threatened by the relentless grind of medieval existence. Your family might sleep on straw next to goats. A peasant whispers to a weary child, smiling despite the aches and chills. But hey, at least you're not alone in your misery. And in that shared misery, a profound lesson emerges. Survival is not just about endurance. It's about connection, creativity, and the stubborn determination of humans to make life work, even in the harshest of worlds. As spring loosens its grip on the frost, and summer stretches its long, warm fingers across the village, life for the peasant does not suddenly become easier, but it does gain moments of color, laughter, and fleeting relief. For amidst the endless toil of fields and barns, there exist days that feel almost magical, where work slows, voices rise in song, and the smell of baked goods drifts across muddy streets. These are the days of festivals, fairs, and small joys, the rare windows of escape in a life otherwise dictated by survival. The church calendar, though rigid and filled with solemn obligation, doubles as a guide for celebration. Saints' days, harvest festivals, and holy holidays punctuate the endless grind of labor, offering peasants something to anticipate beyond the monotonous sunrise to sunset routine. On these days, the village awakens not to the crack of the whip or the bleating of goats, but to the strains of flutes, lutes, and the rhythmic clapping of villagers performing dances passed down through generations. Even the livestock seems to sense the shift in energy, the sheep bleating in a vaguely musical accompaniment to children stamping through the mud in playful rhythm. Temporary market stalls spring up along the village green or main thoroughfare, bringing not only the practical flour, firewood baskets, but also the delightful and distracting pies, sweet buns, and sometimes a rare jug of ale. For children, the sights and smells alone are intoxicating. Sugar is a precious commodity, often reserved for feasts or the wealthier folk, so even a thin drizzle of honey over a warm pastry feels like divine intervention. Peasants, dusty and sweaty from a morning in the fields, lean over the counters, exchanging coins that feel heavier than gold for morsels that taste like fleeting heaven. Games and competitions accompany these fairs. Children race across muddy fields, dodging each other and the occasional wayward chicken. Laughter ringing like tiny bells through the village square. Adults test their strength and skill with tug-of-war ropes, log-carrying contests, and archery displays, their faces flushed with effort and amusement. Victory is fleeting, but pride lingers. And even those who fall in the mud find themselves laughed at, and more importantly, remembered. A simple pie-eating contest becomes a spectacle, a chance to momentarily forget frost-bitten fingers and calloused hands. Music and dance play a central role. The lilt of a fiddle, the drumming of simple wooden percussion, the flapping of skirts, and the stomping of boots combine into a cacophony that, though messy, feels vital. Everyone participates. Grandparents sway with surprising dexterity. Children mimic steps they barely understand, and young couples steal fleeting moments of flirtation amid the clamor. In these moments, even the hardest, most exhausted laborer can feel almost weightless. For a few hours, the fields and barns are forgotten. The village is alive with movement, color, and laughter. The food is as integral to these celebrations as the music. Ale, thin but strong enough to warm the throat and slightly loosen the tongue, flows from wooden barrels into hand-carved mugs. Pies, filled with apples, nuts, or occasionally berries are passed from vendor to vendor. For a peasant who has subsisted on gruel and stale bread, this is an almost scandalous indulgence. Children dart from stall to stall, hands sticky with honey and fingers smeared with flour, while adults exchange playful wagers on who can drink the most ale without spilling or falling over. Even minor indulgences carry significance. A single bite of a sweet bun is not merely food. It is a tiny rebellion against the relentless march of poverty and labor. The ale, weak and cloudy though it may be, becomes a lubricant for conversation, laughter, and community cohesion. For the price of a few coins, villagers acquire more than calories. They purchase joy, distraction, and a reminder of life beyond hardship. And yet, the joys are tinged with absurdity. You might see a man, sweat soaking his tunic, trying to balance a plate of pies while dodging a toddler and a wayward goat. Someone else attempts a dance step and ends up sliding into a mud puddle, eliciting peals of laughter from onlookers. A young boy, eyes wide with ambition, wagers his last coin on a game of skill, only to lose to his sister, who smirks with the cunning of someone who has spent years surviving the daily grind. The communal aspect of these festivals cannot be overstated. They are social glue, reinforcing ties between neighbors who rely on each other for survival year-round. Shared laughter, shared ale, shared food. These are the rituals that sustain the village as much as grain and water. Knowledge, too, is passed along. Which herbs to use in a minor injury, which patches of land yield the best vegetables, how to mend a leaky roof before the next storm. Festivals are classrooms, playgrounds, and marketplaces all at once. The rhythm of the day is hypnotic. Music swells, pies are devoured, ale is sipped or gulped. Children squeal in delight, and elders nod approvingly, their hands resting on canes that have long since learned to steady not just the body but the soul. The work of the fields is momentarily suspended, and for the first time in weeks, months, or even a year, peasants breathe without counting the hours until the next laborious task. Humor surfaces naturally. A drunken man stumbles over a chicken, sending pies flying. A boy tries to show off his dance moves and crashes into a stall, knocking over jars of honey and jam. A group of women laugh, as they attempt to row a makeshift boat across a muddy puddle, only to sink spectacularly. These moments are tiny, ephemeral, and yet essential. In a life otherwise dominated by toil, they are proof that joy can exist even in the harshest of circumstances. The combination of food, music, and games serves a practical function beyond pleasure. A well-fed, well-laughed-at peasant is more resilient the next day, more willing to work, and better equipped to face the constant threats of weather, disease, and famine. Celebration is, in its own way, a survival strategy. An acknowledgement that while life is harsh, community, resourcefulness, and small pleasures sustain it. Even the youngest members of the village learn early that festivals are not merely entertainment. They are opportunities to observe, participate, and acquire skills. Watching a parent haggle for a jug of ale teaches negotiation. Observing a neighbor repair a cartwheel while balancing a pie plate imparts balance and dexterity. Competing in races or games fosters coordination, endurance, and ingenuity. Every moment of pleasure is also a lesson in adaptability, a core survival skill for life in the medieval countryside. And yet, no matter how carefully structured, chaos reigns. A pie might explode in a child's face. A goat may consume the last loaf intended for the festival feast. Someone invariably misjudges a jump and lands in a mud pit. The disorder, though frustrating, also reminds everyone of the essential lesson: life is unpredictable, and the ability to laugh at small disasters is as vital as the ability to sow wheat or build a fence. As the day wanes and the sun begins to sink behind distant hills, villagers gather one last time around the communal hearths, sharing tales of the day's mishaps and triumphs. The songs become softer, the games quieter, and the ale thinner as the fire crackles and the shadows lengthen. Even in the exhaustion, there is a glow of satisfaction, the kind that comes from shared experience, from fleeting joy earned through labor and hardship alike. When the festival ends and the villagers return to their stone cottages and thatched roofs, the work of survival resumes. But the memory of pie-stained hands, honey-slicked hair, and laughter echoing across the fields lingers. For a peasant, these brief moments of indulgence, community, and levity are treasures, tiny beacons of light in the relentless routine of daily existence. You might be starving, sweaty, and covered in hay, one parent mutters as they herd the children back home, but a pie or a jug of weak ale could feel like heaven. And in that heaven, fleeting though it is, there is a lesson that endures. Life may be harsh, disease may be rampant, and the fields may never yield perfectly, but joy, creativity, and community can survive anywhere, even in a medieval village. Just when the sun dips behind the hills and the last echoes of festival laughter fade, the peasant knows that relief is temporary. Hard work never ends in a medieval village, and the shadow of war, both literal and figurative, hangs over even the quietest hamlet. Today, the laughter of children and the smell of freshly baked pies seem distant, almost absurd, as peasants are reminded that their lives are never entirely their own. Lords and kings wield authority with the casual whimsy of fate itself, and the demand for labor, loyalty, or military service could descend like a thunderstorm at any hour. It begins quietly, messengers on horseback, a herald with a horn, or simply a summons scribbled in ink and sealed with wax. The order might call for able-bodied men to join a campaign in distant lands, or for families to provide carts, horses, and untrained laborers to build fortifications. For a peasant, the announcement is both terrifying and frustrating. One moment, you're plowing the fields, swatting flies, and negotiating the delicate balance between goat and grain. The next, you're expected to drop everything and march toward a muddy ditch, a half-finished tower, or a battlefield where the likelihood of survival is slimmer than the chance of a good harvest. Military service was no small request. Unlike the knights in gleaming armor, peasants were expected to provide muscle, endurance, and obedience, often without adequate food, equipment, or instruction. Training might be minimal, protection minimal, and morale. Well, morale was optional. Some were pressed into carrying supplies, digging trenches, or building siege engines. Others were conscripted into infantry lines, armed with a spear, a crude shield, and an instinct for survival. The sun, wind, and rain became your constant companions, as did the fear of disease, injury, or worse. Life could change overnight. One day you were sowing wheat. The next, you were marching toward a border you didn't know existed, under a banner you didn't choose. Feudal obligations compounded the pressure. Lords demanded labor, taxes, and unwavering allegiance, and those demands were enforced with strict cruelty. A missed task, a poorly executed harvest, or even a wrong glance in the presence of a noble could result in fines, floggings, or public humiliation. The peasant learned quickly that survival required both skill and subtlety, know when to comply, when to bend, and sometimes when to nod politely while mentally preparing an escape. Refusal was rarely an option. The consequences were both swift and severe. Yet, for all the danger and oppression, peasants exhibited an astonishing level of ingenuity and resourcefulness. War and forced labor demanded it. Tools had to be improvised, plans devised to conserve strength, and strategies developed to minimize risk. A wooden plow might be repaired with rope, a broken wheel patched with scrap metal, or a ladder reinforced with rough-hewn branches. Even while pressed into the service of a lord, peasants found ways to protect their families, hide small caches of grain, and ensure that a single bad harvest or a week of ditch digging didn't become a death sentence. Trade and market skills became invaluable in this context. Peasants often bartered surplus produce or handmade goods to ensure that, even during conscription, their families had food, tools, and basic necessities. A basket of eggs might be exchanged for a bit of salted fish, a jar of honey, or a few nails. Children, meanwhile, learned the subtle arts of negotiation at a young age, skills that could save their hides if their father was away at war, or their mother needed help defending the household against opportunistic neighbors. The village economy, though simple, was a web of clever transactions designed to mitigate the endless uncertainty of medieval life. In times of war, ingenuity was not limited to economics. Peasants devised methods to survive both the physical and social challenges. If a lord demanded hundreds of ditches to be dug for fortifications, villagers developed rotation systems, shared tools efficiently, and created crude signaling methods to coordinate work without constant oversight. Those with a knack for carpentry, masonry, or metalwork became essential to the project, earning a modicum of leverage with the very nobles who could crush them with a whim. Creativity was survival. A sharp mind could be as valuable as a strong arm, and sometimes far more so. Even in the midst of laborious campaigns or conscription, small moments of joy or cunning appeared. One peasant might slip a stolen apple from the lord's orchard into his satchel, savoring it during a brief rest. A child sent to carry water to a trench might trade a few sips for a piece of bread from a neighbor's basket. Humor, quiet defiance, and ingenuity intertwined, forming a lifeline in a world where authority demanded absolute submission. The physical demands were intense, digging trenches with a wooden spade, hauling stones heavier than your own body weight, or standing for hours under the sun required endurance bordering on inhuman. Yet peasants adapted, their bodies honed by daily farm labor and sharpened by necessity. Even exhaustion was part of a learned rhythm. When to rest, how to pace, and when to risk a small misstep to conserve energy for the tasks that truly mattered. Feeding the family, protecting the crops, and surviving until nightfall. Peasants also learned to read the subtle signals of their environment. A gathering of soldiers, the arrival of a messenger, a distant trumpet. Each carried meaning and demanded an appropriate response. Children, though small, were often enlisted to watch for signs of danger, to relay messages, or to carry essential items. The entire village operated as a living, breathing organism, with each member attuned to the needs of survival in a landscape dominated by lords, soldiers, and the unpredictability of nature. Social bonds became critical. The enforced labor and military service of one family member often required neighbors to step in and assist, whether through shared work, communal meals, or temporary guardianship of children. Festivals and religious holidays became even more vital during these times, providing rare opportunities for rest, nourishment, and social connection. Even under conscription or the threat of forced labor, The village relied on the cohesion, trust, and ingenuity of its members to endure. Humor, a vital survival tool, never completely disappeared. Peasants often laughed at the absurdity of their plight. They joked about the lord who demanded an extra day of ditch digging because his cat fell into a trench, or the awkward attempts of soldiers to direct untrained villagers in the construction of a palisade. Such humor, even when whispered in corners or shared over a stolen loaf of bread, provided psychological relief and reinforced a sense of solidarity. Food, though sparse, remained an anchor. Even when pressed into forced labor, peasants found ways to carry small rations, exchange scraps, or preserve meals for those moments when hunger became unbearable. A handful of nuts, a crust of bread, or a bit of salted meat became both sustenance and a token of defiance against the relentless demands of authority. Ingenuity in rationing and storage was as critical as skill with tools or field labor. Thus, life in the shadow of war and feudal obligation was not merely about suffering. It was about adaptation. Peasants became masters of improvisation, learning to balance the immediate demands of labor with the long-term survival of family, health, and community. Each challenge, be it a conscription order, a sudden harvest failure, or a week-long construction project for a lord's castle, was met with ingenuity, patience, and the quiet defiance that ensured life went on, somehow, against all odds. And yet, humor persisted, a small but essential companion. Imagine finishing a week of back-breaking farm work just to be told, "Congrats! Tomorrow, you'll dig a ditch for a castle," a peasant might mutter with a grin, spitting into the dirt. It's an absurdity that underscores the resilience of a people who learned, day after day, that survival depended not just on strength, but on cleverness, cooperation, and the occasional stolen pie. By the end of the day, when bodies ache, hands blister, and stomachs rumble, the peasant returns home to a hovel that smells faintly of smoke, hay, and last night's bread crusts. The sun sets over a patchwork of fields, hedges, and thatched roofs. Tomorrow, they will rise again, carry their tools, feed their animals, and obey the Lord, all while inventing small solutions to impossible problems and ensuring that life, however harsh, persists. In this crucible of labor, fear, and improvisation, the medieval peasant thrives. They are builders of their own survival, inventors of small miracles, and quiet masters of a world that demands ingenuity as much as obedience. Even in the shadow of castles, armies, and feudal lords, peasants find ways to feed, clothe, and protect their families, securing a legacy of resilience, wit, and resourcefulness that echoes far beyond the stone walls of the village. The sun rises again over the thatched rooftops, brushing the fields with a pale gold, but the light brings little comfort to the medieval peasant. Life, in all its unrelenting hardship, is measured not in hours or days, but in chances survived and risks avoided. Early death is a constant companion, lurking behind every decision, every harvest, every poorly tied knot in a rickety bridge. Epidemics could sweep through a village faster than gossip at a market. Famine waited in the shadow of a failed crop. Accidents lay in every haystack, every unstable ladder, and every sharp-edged tool. And violence? Oh yes, the occasional brawl over a stray goat or unpaid debt could claim life or limb without warning. A peasant's world is a perpetual balancing act on the knife edge between survival and catastrophe. Each day begins with a mental calculation. What is worth the risk? Which plants are safe to forage and which might carry poison masquerading as nourishment? Which water from the stream is clean enough to drink and which might deliver a fever strong enough to bend a grown man double? Decisions that today might seem mundane. A sip from a well, a climb up a ladder, a choice of bread for the day, were matters of life and death. One wrong choice, one miscalculation, and a family could find itself mourning before the sun set. Peasants learned to read their environment with remarkable precision. The color of leaves, the scent of the wind, the behavior of animals, they all became signals, warnings, and guidance. A squirrel feeding nervously in the hedge? Perhaps the field is safe to scavenge. A pond with frothy algae? Likely a source of disease. Every sense sharpened by necessity. every instinct honed by repeated encounters with the consequences of failure. It was a world that offered no second chances, and only the clever, the cautious, and the lucky survived. But survival was about more than avoiding death. It was also about working efficiently, cleverly, and sometimes secretly bending the rules. A peasant might discover a hidden patch of wild garlic or a berry bush, stash a few treasures in the folds of a worn tunic, and savor a tiny victory before the day's labor resumed. When rationing was tight, ingenuity meant turning scraps into meals, stale bread boiled into porridge, leftover vegetables stretched into soups, or root vegetables roasted in a makeshift oven built from clay and stone. Each innovation increased the odds of living another day, another week, another harvest. Despite the dangers, humor and stubborn resilience remained essential. Living a long life, peasants joked in quiet corners or whispered over a communal pot of gruel, is basically winning the medieval lottery with no tickets. The joke wasn't just dark humor, it was a survival mechanism. Laughter, even at the most minor absurdities, tempered fear. A goat chasing a child through the mucked-over yard, a barn collapsing under a storm, a lord's absurd decree about which tools could be used on which day. These small, chaotic moments reminded peasants that life, while brutal, could still be endured with wit intact. Risk was embedded in every action. A simple walk to the mill required vigilance. Slippery stones, unstable bridges, and the ever-present possibility of encountering wolves or bandits made even daily routines precarious. Work in the fields meant exposure to weather extremes, scorching summer sun or icy winter winds, while tending animals brought the possibility of bites, kicks, or infections. The tools themselves, crude and unyielding, were hazards. Wooden plows could splinter, scythes could slip, axes could misfire, and carts could overturn. Even sitting quietly in one's home carried dangers, for fires, collapses, or disease could strike anywhere. Famine was the constant shadow over all. Just a few failed crops could leave families desperate, scavenging roots, berries, or even acorns to survive. Those fortunate enough to store surplus grain knew the value of rationing, careful measurement, and creative culinary reuse. Grinding old bread into porridge, making stews from minimal ingredients, or brewing weak ale from leftover grains. Food wasn't indulgence. It was currency, medicine, and armor against the inevitability of hunger. Health threats compounded daily peril. Without modern medicine, a small wound could fester into gangrene. A simple fever might turn fatal. Epidemics, carried silently through the village, were indiscriminate in their cruelty. Mothers watched children with feverish eyes, knowing that superstition, herbal remedies, or prayers might be all that stood between life and death. They boiled water when possible, sprinkled herbs believed to purify the air, and crossed fingers behind calloused hands, hoping that whatever divine or earthly force governed life would spare their loved ones. Children, meanwhile, learned survival through a combination of observation, imitation, and raw instinct. They quickly understood which chores carried real risk, which tasks were purely for punishment, and how to negotiate brief freedoms or small indulgences. A child who could sneak a piece of bread without attracting the Lord's attention, who could avoid the wrath of a scolding parent while still fulfilling obligations, was a child who might just survive until adolescence. Survival required not only strength and endurance, but cunning, observation, and careful timing. Peasants developed social strategies to mitigate risk. Families shared knowledge of safe routes, secret caches, and natural remedies. Neighbors exchanged warnings about outbreaks of disease or the approach of a raiding party. Even minor innovations like using a rope to stabilize a cart or constructing a simple gutter to divert water could prevent accidents and save lives. The community was a living network of survival, where each small act of ingenuity increased the odds for all. Amid the unrelenting labor and constant threat of death, peasants found ways to maintain small joys and social rituals. Festivals, fairs, and seasonal celebrations provided fleeting relief and a chance to renew social bonds. Children played hidden games. Young couples exchanged shy glances during market days. And even the most downtrodden families celebrated small victories. a full larder, a successful harvest, or a day free of injury. These moments, however brief, were as crucial as food or water. They were sustenance for the soul. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was immense. Fear and anxiety were embedded into daily life. Yet peasants learned to manage these emotions through humor, social bonds, and adaptation. They became masters of mental survival, finding comfort in routines, small victories, and the shared recognition of hardship. The knowledge that all peers faced the same risks offered solidarity, turning individual struggles into collective resilience. Yet humor never entirely vanished. Peasants laughed at the absurdities of feudal life. The lord who demanded 100 extra baskets of apples because his cat sneezed near the harvest. The neighbor who tried to trade a goat for a loaf of bread and got laughed out of the square. Or the absurdity of a child being punished for failing to count pebbles correctly during a harvest. Laughter was a weapon against despair, a silent rebellion against the relentless pressures of survival. Mortality remained a sobering constant. Adults might survive plague, famine, or the Lord's whims, but only by calculation, ingenuity, and sheer stubbornness. Even the most skilled peasant could not escape accidents, disease, or environmental hazards entirely. Life expectancy was short, and the peasant's world was governed by the simple principle that every day survived was a victory. A meal eaten, a task completed, a family protected. These small successes were monumental in a life otherwise defined by struggle. Through all of this, ingenuity flourished. Crops were rotated to maintain soil fertility. Tools were repaired and repurposed creatively, and communities shared knowledge about safe plants, hunting strategies, and water sources. Even under the duress of forced labor, conscription, or famine, peasants demonstrated an astonishing capacity for problem solving. Every obstacle demanded a solution, and every solution increased the chance of survival. At the end of the day, when the sun sets behind the hills, the peasant returns to the hovel, exhausted, calloused, and hungry, but alive. The fire in the hearth is modest, the roof leaky, and the straw mattress uncomfortable, but the family is together, and tomorrow brings another chance to survive, to work, and to find small victories. Each day survived is a testament to endurance, cleverness, and the uncelebrated brilliance of the medieval peasant. Humor lingers in the cracks of hardship. You survived the plague, avoided the Lord's wrath, and didn't get trampled by your own oxen? Congratulations. You're now officially a medieval survival expert. Medal pending. In a world where luxury was a fantasy and life was a constant negotiation with risk, humor, ingenuity, and community, were as essential as bread and water. Through the lens of mortality, risk, and hardship, the peasant's world emerges as one of remarkable resilience. These were people who survived epidemics, famine, natural disasters, and human cruelty, not through luck alone, but through wit, adaptation, and the subtle art of living on the edge. Their legacy is one of creativity under pressure, social cooperation, and the quiet, unglamorous heroism of everyday survival. After a long day of toil, near the dying embers of the hearth, the medieval peasant might pause for the briefest moment of reflection, if reflection were something the day allowed. And yet, in the quiet, one might notice a pattern emerging from all the back-breaking labor, the scraped knees, the hunger pangs, and the close calls with plague or frost. Every field tilled, every ditch dug, every roof repaired was not just survival. It was laying the foundations of the world to come. The work of these unheralded individuals shaped villages, trade routes, and the rhythms of the seasons. Roads carved through forests, bridges spanning rivers, granaries holding stock for the lean months, markets bustling with barter and gossip, all were touched by peasant hands. Without their persistence, ingenuity, and sheer stubbornness, much of medieval Europe might have collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Peasants were not just survivors. They were builders of infrastructure. Think about it. Every plowed field, every irrigation ditch, every handcrafted tool contributed to a complex web that sustained society. They figured out crop rotation, soil fertility, and when to plant or harvest, often through trial and error over generations. A patch of barley might seem trivial, but it kept a family fed and, by extension, a village alive. From the simplest tools fashioned from scrap wood and stone to the more intricate arrangements of mills and water wheels, peasant innovation was the quiet engine of progress. In a way, every cobblestone laid in a village square, or every rudimentary wooden cart that transported goods to market, was a testament to human creativity under pressure. Trade, too, bore their fingerprints. Peasants traveled to markets, carrying baskets of vegetables, dairy, or homemade goods, exchanging them for other necessities or occasionally luxuries. Their ingenuity didn't stop at production. It extended into commerce. They understood supply and demand long before economists wrote papers, recognizing which products sold best, which goods needed protection from spoilage, and how to stretch limited resources. They bartered, negotiated, and sometimes outsmarted wealthier merchants, a subtle reminder that cleverness mattered as much as social rank. Communities thrived because peasants knew they couldn't survive alone. Cooperation was not a philosophical choice, it was a survival strategy. Neighbors shared knowledge about safe drinking water, the timing of planting seasons, and remedies for common illnesses. Families pooled labor for building homes, mending tools, and harvesting crops. Festivals and communal workdays were both necessary and celebratory. They maintained social bonds, distributed resources, and offered brief respite from the unyielding demands of daily life. In their resilience, the seeds of modern civil society were quietly planted. The hardships they endured fostered a form of education impossible to find in palaces or cathedrals. Children learned practical skills, observation, and improvisation from the start. They witnessed, absorbed, and participated in the art of survival skills that could be the difference between life and death. Every failure, every scraped hand, every frostbitten toe carried lessons. Ingenuity wasn't a hobby. It was an existential requirement. And those who survived to adulthood carried this knowledge forward, passing it down like an inheritance more valuable than gold. Of course, survival was a social performance as well. Peasants had to maintain appearances before their lords, demonstrating obedience and diligence, while subtly bending rules to maximize efficiency or secure minor comforts. Cleverness in hiding extra grains, diverting water to the most productive patch, or creating improvised shelters was rewarded with survival, if not with praise. Humor, sly jokes, shared in the barn, or at communal meals, became a secret form of resistance, a mental refuge from unending toil. You survived another day without getting eaten by wolves or floggings from the Lord? Congratulations. You're now a master of medieval multitasking. They might whisper to each other, laughter muffled by mud and straw. Their cultural imprint extended beyond labor and survival. Folk tales, songs, and rituals often reflected peasant experiences. Stories of clever farmers outwitting a cruel lord, of brave children gathering herbs to heal a sick parent, or of entire villages surviving winter famine through collective effort. These narratives reinforced social cohesion, transmitted practical knowledge, and provided moral frameworks, emphasizing resilience, ingenuity, and the importance of solidarity. In their songs, dances, and communal festivals, one can see the faint outlines of modern celebrations and shared cultural identity. Even in the face of plagues, famine, and war, peasants contributed to technological and agricultural progress. Simple innovations, a better plow, a sturdier cartwheel, a more efficient grain storage method spread organically. The wisdom of centuries accumulated quietly in the villages, becoming the backbone for improvements that centuries later would fuel industrial growth. Every incremental change, every clever adaptation, was a brick in the foundation of modern society. They were architects of survival, engineers of everyday life, and teachers of practical wisdom. And yet, the legacy of the peasant extends beyond the physical and practical. There is a moral and social lesson embedded in their experience. In the relentless trials of their existence, peasants cultivated patience, resourcefulness, empathy, and community-mindedness. They demonstrated that cooperation, observation, and intelligence are as vital as strength and endurance. Theirs was a world of scarcity, danger, and unpredictability. Yet human ingenuity, humor, and solidarity allowed life to continue. They remind us that comfort and luxury are not prerequisites for creativity or social cohesion. Humor remained their quiet companion, A peasant might finish a day's labor, blistered and hungry, look at the sun sinking over a muddy field, and think, "I've survived frost, hunger, plague, and my Lord's whims today. Tomorrow, I'll tackle weeds." The joke isn't just dark. It's survival. And it's timeless. Every era has its challenges. Every era requires adaptation, wit, and occasional humor to endure. In reflection, the medieval peasant's life, though harsh, is not just a story of suffering. It's a story of human resilience, innovation under pressure, and the extraordinary capacity to adapt. Their labor-fed communities built infrastructure and sustained societies through centuries. Their ingenuity created tools, farming methods, and social networks that laid the groundwork for modern agriculture, commerce, and rural life. Every cobblestone, every harvest, every secret trick to stretch food or repair a roof is a testament to their resourcefulness. So, the next time you complain about chores, miss a deadline, or grumble at a cold shower, remember the medieval peasant. They rose with the sun, battled exhaustion, famine, disease, and social hierarchy, and still managed to invent, trade, and build a life under conditions we can hardly imagine. Their legacy is etched not just in history books, but in the very systems of agriculture, commerce, and community that sustain the modern world. And finally, as you sit back in your soft chair, scrolling through modern conveniences, spare a thought for those who lived on the edge of survival. They didn't have comfort, vacations, or ease. They had ingenuity, grit, and the unbreakable will to live. Their lives were a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity, and their lessons, wrapped in straw, mud, and sweat, remain surprisingly relevant today. Next time you grumble about a long day at work or chores at home, remember peasants spent years harvesting, building, and surviving with nothing but grit, wit, and a pile of hay. Appreciate your modern comforts. And maybe, just maybe, tip your hat to the medieval peasant.